Hi, I'm Ted Siegel, and I'm the author of Signs of the Great Refusal, The Coming Struggle for a Postwork Society, Punctum Books, 2023. And I'd like to thank Eileen and Vincent and everyone at Punctum Books for this opportunity to be part of the Encounters with Authors series. I guess it makes sense to start by introducing myself. I'm not a professor. Only half jokingly, I tend to think of myself as an organic intellectual of the tech sector PMC, professional managerial class. Prior to 2020, I worked in Silicon Valley for 20 years in program management, marketing, operations, and a variety of roles related to enterprise software, semiconductor, and optical telecom industries. And I also served as a senior manager of Silicon Valley partnerships for the University of California with responsibility for major R&D contracts and initiatives between academia, government, agencies, and private companies. I have an MA in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, where I attended the PhD program with emphasis on moral and political philosophy. My dissertation project under the late Agnes Heller was on the normative and utopian foundations of modernity. Prior to living in New York City, I spent time as a street activist in San Francisco, participating in ACT UP and Radical Ferry actions and community events in the 1980s. And during that time, I had jobs at Tikkun magazine and at the Socialist Review. Based on this intro, you might be wondering, what kind of a book is this? Some of my friends have referred to it as a 450-page tantrum, and I would have to say that I have to admit that they are not entirely wrong. But the answer that I give is generally that because I've been an aspiring academic, a street activist, and for most of my adult life, a working professional, the book is part academic research, part activist theory, part memoir, and I'm not afraid to say it, part professional self-help book. Signs of the Great Refusal weaves together current affairs, political and social theory, and aspects of personal narrative. I also want to say that I don't belong to what I sometimes think of as the Puritan left, addressing myself to an ideal proletariat. The book is leftist political theory designed to give ammunition to younger generations of educated workers who want to challenge the dominant paradigm of work in our society. There is a prominent thread of generational politics running through the book, and I eventually get around to showing how I think this is related to the traditional politics of class. In Signs of the Great Refusal, I explore the idea that it might actually make sense for all of us collectively to begin to refuse the conditions of work as we know it. I realize that it's a rather outrageous idea, especially since I'm not talking about petitions for better pay, improved working conditions, and that kind of thing on the part of the organized industrial labor force. I have in mind something much more expansive and fundamental, something that necessarily concerns almost all wage laborers, including not just service industry and fire sectors contributors, but also tech workers, middle managers, members of the professions, the self-employed, and the underemployed. What then are the conditions which so extravagantly call forth such a non-traditional form of solidarity on the part of a heretofore non-existent collective subject? They aren't hard to come by. Think post-Fordist precarity. Think financialization of everything. Think the bullshitification of jobs. Think neo-rentier debt peonage. increasingly authoritarian employment contracts, the erasure of the barrier between work and private life, and the enlistment of everyone's life energy on behalf of their employer. So think exhaustion, stress and anxiety, depression, and despair. Reading a little bit now from the preface. Almost anywhere one chooses to look, there is evidence that long-standing expectations surrounding the experience of work and the structure of wage-based society are breaking down. Including in this are expectations around social benefits, job stability, and the availability of full-time work, collaborative management cultures, worker-friendly regulatory regimes, and the role of automation and technology in job roles, work performance, and surveillance. The COVID-19 pandemic has served to rend the veil of corporate PR so that beneath the continued rhetoric of partnership and teamwork, one can see clearly the dull glint of underlying structures of domination and coercion. But the issues with work and wage-based society actually go far deeper and precede pandemic-era disputes over work rules, work-life balance, and mass resignations by years, if not decades. This book is about these deeper issues surrounding the collapse of wage-based society, its division of social labor, and the revocation of its implicit social contract, namely that if you are prepared to work hard, you can expect to make a living that will support a decent life for yourself and those closest to you. As a blanket reappraisal, it also involves beginning to imagine the transition to a post-work society, where the conditions of work and social experience generally have been radically transformed. In this respect, Signs of the Great Refusal should be understood as aligned with present international debates and explorations found under the headings of post-work theory, the anti-work movement, and degrowth economics. But where others strive to envision the particulars of this world to come, elaborating an array of specific post-work imaginaries, or emphasizing generative policies to bring about new and transitional forms, I have chosen to remain focused on prospects for active resistance or refusal. In my view, it's important to try to think about post-work as a political struggle, even if the chances of this materializing must be rated as rather dim. Signs of the Great Refusal thus concerns the status of the post-work political imaginary as a necessary condition for a politics of refusal that would be capable of deploying successful strategies and tactics. Social and political conditions that we find unacceptable generally tend to generate a will to negation, and along with it, a change in consciousness. But what really matters is whether the various signs of this refusal can grow into a mass movement for change, or what, following Herbert Marcuse, one might call a form of the Great Refusal. In an article on postwork for The Guardian, British journalist Andy Beckett writes that work increasingly forms our routines and psyches, squeezing out other influences, and does so to such an extent that the things we rely on to give life meaning, like religion, party politics, and community, fade away. And yet it is also true, he does not fail to point out, that work is not working for ever more people and in ever more ways. And Beckett goes on to count the ways: as subsistence, i.e. the problem of the working poor; as a source of social mobility and self-worth, college graduates making you a latte; as precarious, as pointless, and even socially damaging; as incredibly stressful, and thus bad for your health; as poorly distributed, people have too much or too little; and finally as something endangered and may be facing extinction as the result of increasing automation. The growing body of literature on the problem of work today tends to present readers with what I consider to be an unacceptable either-or. Either it encourages people to lean in and further commodify themselves as successful human capitals, embracing some version of the prosperity gospel, or it offers palliative care for the commodified neoliberal self, capitalist spirituality's projects of self-optimization, recovery, and wellness. In response, this book is offered as a kind of an intervention in insufficiently radicalized mainstream debates about the future of work. Signs of the Great Refusal is thus meant to be synergistic with various other titles that might be described as leftist critiques of work with a practical intent. In the spirit of Kathy Weeks' The Problem with Work, 2011, therefore, the objective here is also to contribute to overcoming inattention to work within political theory, and thereby to challenge the privatization of work, promote the understanding of work as primarily a social relation, and to encourage a cross-class politics of refusal of work as we know it. The framing hypothesis of the book is that if there is a chance that something like the Great Resignation could turn out to be a form of the Great Refusal, it is necessary to first overcome various capitalist realist dogmas about work and to recognize and to understand the trajectory of wage-based society in the post-Fordist digital age. The experience, meaning, and social significance of work is changing. Capital is now fulfilling its 400-year-old dream of dispensing with labor through technological innovation. It is disinvesting in liberal democratic society and withdrawing support for public goods through its refusal to pay taxes, thereby exiting the wage-based society that it created. At the same time, we are still told that absorption in work is a moral virtue and the key to a happy and successful life. But there are other ways to achieve these satisfactions other than, for example, total immersion in corporate profit generation, other ways of being useful to oneself and others. I am of the view that if we are going to avoid the most dystopian versions of the post-work society, we are going to have to fight for it, which is why the word struggle is in the subtitle of my book. To do that, work itself will have to become a political issue. And if that's going to happen, then work will need to be deprivatized, stop being something we all just suffer privately according to our individual fortunes, our successes and failures. The book has four main overarching categories which combine and recombine and are explained and fleshed out across the various chapters. The experience of work as we know it, the post-work political imaginary, the idea of a post-work society, and the politics of refusal. If I were a professional academic, I suppose I would have just had 4 chapters, one for each of these conceptual moments. But the structure of the book is not driven by a simple analytical imperative, but rather by a practical political one. So the overall structure is more synthetic. The 3 parts of the book are written in somewhat different registers, so the structure actually represents a certain rhetorical strategy. And I hope to, have time to explain a little bit about that. We'll see. My point of departure here is Herbert Marcuse's remark that the Great Refusal takes a variety of forms, which I've made the book's epigrammatic quote. What is meant by the Great Refusal? By way of Alfred North Whitehead, Rosa Luxemburg, Jacques Le Goff, and Marcuse, among others, the term the Great Refusal has come to stand for a sort of an ideal type that manifests in various forms, only becoming real through scenes of specific concrete collective action. In Marcuse, therefore, the Great Refusal becomes precisely a way to refer to aggregated social movements of resistance against capitalist forms of domination that operate in the absence of any discernible revolutionary working class consciousness. In the book's introduction, however, I actually start off with a consideration of the so-called Great Resignation. I end up characterizing it as a kind of a slow-rolling, half-conscious wildcat strike, and I ask the question of what it would take for something like the Great Resignation to become an instance of the Great Refusal. Effective resistance to domination today needs to find new ways to take the fight directly to the process of capitalist accumulation. The politics of refusal of work as we know it is a necessary complement to things like the intersectional politics of identity. As mentioned, I explore a possible politics of refusal of work today. This thread runs throughout the book at different levels. Initially, in the first chapter, I provide a grounding for a politics of refusal anthropologically, finding evidence for the workings of refusal in theories of cultural change, as found in Carol McGranahan, David Graeber, and via Graeber, Marcel Mauss, Gregory Bateson, Mick Taussig, and Peter Lamborn Wilson. In chapter 2, which is devoted to the signs of an emerging attitude of the refusal of work, I look at the figures of Diogenes the Cynic, Melville's Bartleby, and Henry David Thoreau in the work of David Grief and Jenny Odell. It gets dealt with again in chapter 5, where I consider prospects for a new generational politics, and especially in the last chapter where I consider the operismo or workerist Marxism in Italy in the 1970s as a case study in refusal. What can I say here quickly about the post-work political imaginary? This term stands for the minimal set of things that I think are the necessary condition for a politics of refusal of work as we know it. The use of the term imaginary here comes from Castoriadis's The Imaginary Institution of Society, 1975, where the author describes how overarching social realities get constructed at the level of culture. Understanding the social imaginary starts with the recognition that overarching webs of social signification are hegemonic. They build a sensus communis, a common sense, that installs a particular worldview as the universal horizon of a society, one which permeates social institutions and cultural values, and they normalize, that is to say, mask, their ideological function as something ahistorical and politically neutral. Castoriadis's description of social imaginaries have been taken up by theorists of degrowth economics who elaborate on what they call degrowth imaginaries. An aspect of this has been the description of what are called postwork imaginaries, which delineate either in utopian fashion or else more concretely what the world of work could or would look like if we were actually to make radical changes. So my use of the post-work political imaginary is meant to be a radicalization of this idea. By adding the word political here, my intention is once again to focus attention on the kind of politics or struggle it would take to actually bring about this alternative reality, i.e. the kind of post-work society that we might want to live in. The elements of the post-work political imaginary that I describe include things like explicit resistance to conditions of precarity, arbitrary purposeless jobs, authoritarian workplaces, and the harvesting of our personal biopower. It further includes the social decolonization of key capitalist realist notions that are important to the functioning of the wage-based society. For example, challenges to capitalist dogmas concerning usefulness, idleness and leisure, productivity, cycles of rest, debt forgiveness, and of course things like the degree to which wage-based society continues to be structured by gendered notions of productivity and the division of labor. The post-work political imaginary also has to include an understanding of the transition from Fordism to post-Fordist patterns of work in the digital age, replete with new opportunities and risks for either subjection, meaning domination, or else for subjectification, i.e. autonomous self-fashioning, and thus for the decommodification of labor. The middle part of the book concerns the meaning and significance of work in the modern age. I stage a kind of a running argument between Hannah Arendt and Marx about the meaning and significance of work as waged work within the wage-based society. And then I look at the changing nature of work within the wage-based society, the changing nature of value and of work in the digital age. With this in mind, post-work society stands for whatever is now coming into existence, along with the increasing collapse of modern societies, of modern capitalism's wage-based society. Finally, the post-work political imaginary and the politics of refusal also include the elaboration of approaches to an exodus, i.e., the establishment of an autonomous counterpublic that could serve as an alternative to our presently collapsing occupational pseudo-public sphere. I'm going to hop around a bit now and read some short sections from different parts of the book. This section is from Chapter 4, Reclaiming Idleness from the Work, Laziness, Leisure Nexus. And this is the opening of that chapter. Comparing painter George Seurat's much celebrated A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte with his somewhat less famous Bathers at Asnières, we are invited into a certain kind of dialogue, a contrapuntal reflection on the differences between idleness and leisure. Looking at these paintings, what do we see? Grande Jatte shows affluent, middle-class figures, smartly dressed for a Sunday in the park, engaged in various acts of what Veblen called conspicuous leisure, performing their pecuniary emulation of the leisure class, and playing their part in what Guy Debord later referred to as the society of the spectacle. Asnières, by contrast, shows working-class men and boys idling in midday stillness on the banks of the Seine, the workaday world of industrial Paris visible in the background. Idleness and leisure, as this suggests, indicate a differential signification. Leisure and idleness are not the same. Where leisure is generally something consistent with existing hegemonic social arrangements and is even sanctioned within capitalist relations of production, idleness is something else, something considered to be a vice, something thought to be identical with, or at least akin to laziness, which these dominant interests everywhere aggressively oppose. Thierry Pacou's The Art of the Siesta, from 2003, opens his own meditation on idleness by surveying the many instances of midday repose found in European painting since the Renaissance. In works such as Bruegel the Elder's The Land of Cockaigne and The Harvesters, we see a dream of indolence, rest, and abundance, and the courtesans, bathers, and prostitutes that populated the canvases of Orientalists, Impressionists, Pointillists, and Fauves are as indolent as they are active at their siestas. This is not to deny that the numerous situations depicting figures in states of repose in modern painting can be seen to stem in large part from the formal requirements of naturalistic depictions of the human body. Likewise, it's not to deny that many such situations find their raison d'etre in stylistic references to traditional pre-modern subjects, both Greco-Roman and biblical. Rather, it is simply to point out that in the innumerable lunches in the grass, we also find individuals surrendering themselves, or just about to surrender themselves, to the siesta. Pacou writes, Manet, Monet, Lautrec, Gauguin, and many more have depicted the arresting passage of time, that break in the day, that time to oneself. It would never form the central theme or title of a painting, but its presence is indisputable. Pacou wants us to regard these scenes of daytime idling, these representations of the siesta, as referring to something that is more than just the act of falling asleep or dozing in the middle of the day. The creation and reception of such scenes in the modern period, he thinks, inevitably must also involve an implicit statement about the growing ubiquity of homogeneous abstract time, the regularity of which imposes a discipline upon natural rhythms. Seen in this light, he says, the siesta functions as a metaphor for the capacity we have to dictate the use of our own time rather than submitting to time imposed by society. In the siesta, time becomes a kind of a singularity that shapes daily existence through a dialectic of tension and relaxation. Through its rhythm, it supports an experience of human life as a succession of experiences whose order is not always apparent. Drawing on E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, Pacou points out that already by 1700, European societies were entering the familiar landscape of industrial capitalism, with its timesheets, timekeeper, and informers to find and expose indolent and tardy workers. In 18th and 19th century European societies, where time was ceasing to be a succession of experiences, but rather a collection of hours, minutes, and seconds, scenes of country dwellers and field workers harmonizing their time with that of nature reflect a reaction to the discipline of the industrial process having escaped the confines of the factory floor. The valorization of idleness today and the defense of the siesta as a cultural institution, therefore, are intended by Pacou as a strategy of resistance against the continued production of global time, which he says has infiltrated everywhere, shamelessly presenting itself as self-evident, self-defining, and incontestable. At first blush, imagining how this might be effective can be hard to do, especially for those with a radical bent. We quite naturally tend to envision the path to a changed reality to be found by means of dramatic calls to political action. Here, though, Pacou wants us to try to imagine the myriad ways in which individual experience and social life might change if significant numbers of people insisted on experiencing time differently and live the course of the day according to a different rhythm. In this respect, what Pacou has in mind here is reminiscent of Jenny Odell's claim that in some contexts doing nothing can be an act of political resistance. The various stubborn nothings, Odell says, which produce no deliverables, can't easily be used or appropriated by the dominant capitalist value system. If Pacou is right in insisting that the integrity of the siesta should be seen as part of a process to reclaim our right to inhabit time, to assert its non-commercial use in the name of autonomy, then it behooves us to reach for a deeper understanding of how it is that idleness is actually something worthy, and thus something distinct from laziness and from leisure. Since capitalist ideology unequivocally equates idleness with laziness and seeks instead to promote leisure, the negation of this negation of idleness has a role to play within the broader intention to challenge our pervasive capitalist realist understanding of work in the modern age. Since this is probably getting a little bit long, I'm going to read two more sections. This first one is from the beginning of chapter 12, called On the Seducements of Capitalist Spirituality. If work today has really gotten you down, you are not alone. In the United States, lots of boomers, well past working age, chase seasonal retail and wonder how they could have worked so hard and still have so little to show. Much of Gen X's PMC is already suffering from serious burnout and will be exiting, voluntarily or not, long before the age of 65. Among millennials who invested heavily in college, there is a strong feeling of having been shafted by the disappearing social contract of U.S. capitalism. As for Gen Z, the bulk of whom are now college age, there is a lot of uncertainty. Nobody really knows what the landscape of post-pandemic higher ed looks like, much less what sort of economy they will be entering. Throughout this book, I have been probing the possibility, however dim it may be, that the conditions of work as we know it today might be challenged by forms of collective action, something that implies the thorny prerequisite of increased solidarity across traditional social divisions. The logic has gone something like this. If we come to recognize the pervasive exodus of capital from its own work-based society and see the abandonment of such things as full employment, social benefits, and public goods as a defining characteristic of late capitalism, then we must also recognize the need for an updated concept of political struggle. Given the increasing imposition of a post-Fordist neoliberal capitalist non-society, the updated concept of struggle thus involves the liberation of work itself from what John Holloway has called the gelatinous suction of the capitalist social synthesis. The struggle today is not so much about winning concessions from capital, as in traditional trade unionism, but rather turns out to be a struggle against the continued preeminence of wage labor per se under post-Fordist conditions where it is in fact steadily disappearing. The recognized need to break with the overarching logic of capital in order to escape the fabric of capitalist social domination, therefore, calls forth what one might refer to as a politics of refusal. But this immediately raises the question of precisely how we want to specify this kind of politics. For his part, Holloway has stated, for example, that the constant assertion of our concrete doing over and against abstract labor should be understood as a form of collective self-therapy. Open every moment and fill it with activity that does not contribute to the reproduction of capital, and then multiply all the little rebellions. From there, the task is apparently to stitch together these 1,000 points of light, presumably under the banner of what in the Francophone world is called the International Mouvement Altermondialiste. I tend to be skeptical of critical theories that characterize a sought-after politics as a kind of collective self-therapy, presumably as a way to fill the hole that remains once revolutionary zeal has waned both practically and theoretically. This is because much of what goes by the name of self-help, self-care, self-optimization, and so on has already been thoroughly co-opted and enlisted to meet the needs of capital. Bifo Berardi points out that digital technology has now enabled capitalism to harness mental labor as production and to extend work beyond traditional wage labor to include mind, language, and creativity as elements of the production process itself. For aspects of mental labor to become stable elements of production, all that is needed is that the person as a whole has to be swallowed up by their work. This is what Berardi means by the soul at work. If today we are seeing an epidemic of fear, anxiety, and depression, Berardi writes, it's important to remember that these things continually disturb the normal flow of capitalist validation in the new economy as a consequence of these very working conditions. What then is the potential vector from alienation to autonomy now that work harnesses the parts of ourselves that in the past were left to us when the workday was over? Like Holloway, Berardi thinks that we require a shift in the social investment of desire away from work with the prescription to transform politics into a social therapy of that desire. But it seems like this characterization of modes of refusal as collective self-therapy hits a major snag if capital has thoroughly co-opted the parts of the self that are supposed to be the seat of this resistance. This whole line of reasoning brings up a number of disquieting questions. Can something like an aesthetics of existence really be marshaled as a politics of refusal today, when projects of self-optimization, recovery, wellness, and personal happiness are actually what capital most fervently recommends? Also, how should one orient oneself with respect to personal projects of healing and recovery, of mindfulness, wellness, and happiness, if the things one wishes to recover from are all ills arising in relation to hegemonic neoliberal capitalism? Is there or should there be a connection between our diverse projects of personal recovery and social political movements of resistance and refusal? Certainly, millions of people make good use of self-help instruction to embark upon personal journeys of recovery and self-optimization. and obtain real and even lasting therapeutic benefit. And one can easily argue that well-considered programs of intentional self-care are a universal precondition for just about any other sorts of projects. As RuPaul says, if you can't love yourself, how are you going to love somebody else? But maybe there are still some good reasons to retain a healthy skepticism toward hyper-individualist programs for changing the world one individual at a time, even if leading gurus from RuPaul to Jon Kabat-Zinn have things of value to offer us. Ronald Purser has written that mindfulness is therapy for capitalist realists who have swallowed the idea that there is no alternative to the market logic of Margaret Thatcher. What if, as Slavoj Žižek has also pointed out, mindfulness as a set of practices that encourages a particular kind of self-knowledge and self-care is actually establishing itself as the hegemonic ideology of global capitalism? I'm going to read just a little further on this. Perhaps like millions of other people, including a great many born into advantages of race, gender, and class, you suffer from PTSD, anxiety, or depression caused by long-term job precariousness. Or maybe you also exhibit some combination of real or psychosomatic illnesses, attributable at least in part to the effects of workplace powerlessness or toxicity or the bullshitification of work. Maybe you are feeling really burned out because your job makes increasing demands on your personal biopower. You work massive overtime and you are always on call and monitoring communications. If you work in media-oriented parts of the services sector, perhaps your employer seeks to leverage various aspects of your personality or talents or interests, and even seeks to dictate aspects of your lifestyle. For those afflicted by some combination of work-related maladies, again, PTSD, anxiety, depression, despair, eating disorders, substance abuse, other neuroses, sleep problems, burnout, bore-out, it's only natural to want to try to save oneself from a life cut short. It makes sense to look for recovery, for healing, for a new way of managing one's life energies, a new life path. Recovering a sense of well-being in the face of these conditions can take many months or even years of patient and determined effort, even assuming the most ideal conditions. If you are someone who is an active participant in an organized religion, then you probably reach out to a pastor, rabbi, or imam for guidance, and in response to your concerns, you are encouraged to deepen your expression of devotion and your commitment to your family and faith community. I'm told that for the faithful, this sort of guidance offers at least a quantum of solace, even if one still must render unto Caesar and or bow before Mammon. But if you belong to the PMC, professional managerial class, or if you find your direction rather osmotically via popular culture and advertising messages, then it's likely that you frame your problem in spiritual terms and seek help with self-help via offerings available in the spiritual wellness marketplace. What does one find there? Almost without exception, if one cares to look closely enough, one finds a rather improbable amalgam, a strange stew of loosely combined elements. William Davies says that the psychology of motivation blends into the physiology of health, drawing insights from sports coaches and nutritionists, to which is added a cocktail of neuroscience and Buddhist meditation. Various notions of fitness, happiness, positivity, and success blend into one another with little explanation of how or why. In a similar vein, Purser has called this sort of self-help material spiritual practice junk food and has given it the derisive label McMindfulness. He takes a dim view of its breezy claim to have captured the essence of Buddhism without the mumbo-jumbo of beliefs, rituals, institutions, and cultural baggage, because everything important is now based on the latest neuroscience. And yet one must assume that the majority of those who consume this motivational self-help literature find it to be essentially coherent. What then is the underlying but otherwise invisible substrate that calls that, invisible substrate that supports all these disparate elements, what Nicholas Rose calls this bricolage. For critics such as Davies, the happiness industry, Purser, McMindfulness, and Corrett and King, selling spirituality, and Ehrenreich, natural causes, the essential connective tissue is nothing other than capitalist spirituality. What brings together sportsmen, business gurus, and statisticians to extend lessons from sport into politics, from warfare into business strategy, and from life coaching into schools, Davies says, is the science of winning to entrench neoliberal competitiveness as the defining culture of business, cities, schools, and nations. I'm going to stop here. I've read plenty. Unfortunately, I haven't given a sense of all the different twists and turns in the book, but I hope I've given enough for you to have a feel for it. And thanks to all of you for your interest and for hearing me talk a little bit about my new book.